Parliament intend to give to Her Majesty to mark this historic occasion. In 1977, to mark Her Majesty's Silver Jubilee, the Fountain New Palace Yard was built. In 2002, to mark the Golden Jubilee, the sundial in Old Palace Yard was installed. And in 2012, to mark Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee, the stained glass window in Westminster Hall was commissioned. The House will therefore be pleased to hear that a gift has now been commissioned for Her Majesty from Parliament to mark her Platinum Jubilee in 2022. It is now open to all members of both Houses to contribute towards this gift. I invite honourable members to do so, as was the case in 2012 when hundreds of parliamentarians contributed towards the Diamond Jubilee gift. This gift will also be funded by personal contributions from members of both Houses, entirely at their own discretion. It is proposed that no public funds will be spent on the gift. I have written to all members with details of the gift and how they may wish to contribute. I warmly encourage them to do so. Right, let us come to questions to the President of COP26. And welcome to the new position. We have a substantive question from Mark Menzies.
Go.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 1, 2, 3 and 4 together. We are determined to build back better and greener as we recover from COVID-19. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution sets out the government's blueprint to grow sunrise sectors, support 250,000 green jobs and level up across the country.
We now go up to the northwest with Mark Menzies. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The northwest, as you're very well aware, is the heart of the UK nuclear industry, including Westinghouse Nuclear Fuels in my constituency. With the world increasingly focused on utilising low-carbon energy sources, what steps is my right honourable friend, the President of COP, taking ahead of COP26 to promote UK-based nuclear energy production, satisfying our future energy needs and supporting countless high-skilled jobs across the northwest?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Nuclear power clearly has a part to play in our clean energy mix, and he will know in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan we've committed to backing large-scale nuclear AMRs and SMRs, and of course the sites like the ones in his constituency are vital in terms of creating jobs and investment in the northwest.
We're going to go to Flick Drummond. Flick Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome my right honourable friend to his new appointment too? Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Prime Minister's 10-point plan not only helps places like Meon Valley build back better and greener from COVID, but will also level up all regions across the country too?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The 10-point plan will be a catalyst to unleash innovation and jobs across the country. We're going to have a green industrial revolution which is going to be powered by wind turbines in Scotland and the North East, propelled by electric vehicles made in the Midlands, and of course supported by carbon capture clusters across our industrial heartlands.
Let's head north to Imran Hussain. Imran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public transport is one of the cleanest modes of transport we have by helping to get thousands of carbon-emitting vehicles off our roads. But our public transport infrastructure, particularly rail, is woefully outdated in the north of England and simply not fit for purpose. Will you therefore back my calls for the Northern Powerhouse Rail Scheme to be built in full, including a Bradford City Centre station, to prove that we are taking this climate emergency seriously by getting more people onto public transport and more cars off our roads in the north and providing good, green, sustainable jobs?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree that we should be encouraging people to take public transport where that's possible. I come in from Reading to Paddington every day by train myself. He's raised a policy issue relating to the Department of Transport, and I'll make sure that I make representations on his behalf to the Secretary of State.
Shadow Minister Matthew Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week, the government will co-host a summit of the Powering Past Coal Alliance to boost international cooperation on the phasing out of coal. Yet at the same time, ministers are refusing to intervene here at home to prevent the opening of a new deep coal mine in Cumbria. The President knows full well that the proposed mine is not purely a local matter, that it will not help secure the future of UK steel, and that it will not provide the long-term secure jobs that Cumbrians need, but it will increase emissions, undermine progress to our net zero target, and damage our credibility as COP26 host. My question to him, therefore, is a simple one, Mr. Speaker. In this critical year, why on earth are he and his cabinet colleagues content to see this mine approved?
President Sharma.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I note the point he makes about the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I'm very proud that the UK is part of leading that. And of course, we've made significant progress in reducing coal as part of our energy mix over the last decade. It's come down from 40% to just under 2%. And now, I set out my detailed views on this issue at the Base Select Committee hearing, as he will know. What I would say to him is that this is now a local matter. It is a local issue. The councillors on Cumbria County Council are considering this application, and like him, I await to see the outcome of that.
We have a substantive question to President Sharma. We have a substantive question to you.
All right. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 6 and 7 together. Businesses have a vital role to play in tackling climate change. Through the COP26 Business Leaders Group and indeed in other engagements in the UK and internationally, I've spoken directly with many hundreds of global businesses, and of course we are calling on businesses, investors and other non-state actors to sign up to the Race to Zero campaign and commit to achieving net zero emissions by 2050.
Let's head up to the West Midlands with Nicola Richards. Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're hugely proud of our diverse communities in West Bromwich East, and many of my constituents place a great importance on the role of our allies across the world, especially in India, in working with the UK to tackle these global issues. Can my right honourable friend update the House on the success of his recent international engagement?
President Sharma.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend and indeed the House that over the past few weeks I've had productive discussions with government ministers on visits to Ethiopia, Gabon, Egypt, Nigeria, Nepal and India. And of course, she mentions India. I also met with Prime Minister Modi in Delhi. I've also spoken to a range of other governments, including UN Special Envoy John Kerry and China's Special Envoy for Climate Change, Minister Shi Zhenhua. And I've stressed the importance of the 3 key pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation and finance.
Let's go to Virginia Crosby. Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 1st of July, I'm delighted that the Minister for Science, Research and Technology will be coming to Anglesey to open an innovation jobs fair I'm organising along with the Menai Science Park. This event will bring together innovative green businesses like Morelice and Beacon Biocomposites to showcase their work. This event offers a perfect opportunity to put a spotlight on COP26 for the communities and businesses here in my Unismore constituency. Will the COP President ensure that there will be resources available to help me do this? Thank you.
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to my honourable friend's excellent work in supporting green jobs in her constituency. And of course, as hosts of the G7 and COP26, we want to showcase innovative British green businesses, such as those being housed by the Menai Science Park in her constituency. And I'm absolutely delighted that the Science Minister is opening her Innovation Jobs Fair, and I know that they will both work very closely together to ensure that it is a success.
Let's head up to Edinburgh with Deirdre. Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In those discussions with interested parties, did they ask why the UK's objectives are so vague and so unambitious? Did they point out that the UK government has missed a slew of targets on the climate change emergency and there appears to be little to no effort being made to catch up? How can the UK government pretend to any world leadership on this issue when it shows such a marked reluctance to act at all?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would just suggest respectfully to the Honourable Lady that she look at the record of this government. In terms of cutting emissions, we were the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero. And of course, she, I hope, will also have been pleased by not just the 10-point plan, but also the very ambitious nationally determined contribution that the Prime Minister set out last year.
Substantive question to Minister Trevelyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Excuse me. The UK is leading from the front and has made significant commitments under all 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement, which, as the President has set out, mitigation, finance and adaptation and resilience. And we are continuing to press for ambition internationally, discussing climate action with world leaders. Our nationally determined contribution, of course, sets the highest level of emissions reductions by 2030 of any major economy.
Let's go across to Alison Thewlis. Alison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Angel Gurria, the outgoing Secretary-General of the OECD, has urged countries to attach environmental conditions to bailouts, to prioritise a green recovery with environmental jobs, and, I quote, to put a big fat price on carbon. So will the UK government take Angel Gurria's advice?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are absolutely leading the way in making sure that as part of our Building Back Better and Greener, we do that. I am co-chairing with the Department of Education a Green Jobs Task Force to make sure that we are able to both upskill and train all the new skills that are going to be needed for those new industries.
Let's go to Shadow Minister Stephen Morgan. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Improving air quality is an essential part of our work to tackle the climate emergency. Yet the government refused to back Labour's call to make sure air quality targets meet WHO guidelines by 2030. What will the Minister do to ensure we are truly world leading in our efforts to reduce emissions?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As President Sharma has set out, we are absolutely world leading in tackling our CO2 emissions, and part of the work with our landmark environment bill will be indeed to get to grips with and lead again worldwide so that others can follow on air quality.
We now have another substantive question to Minister Trelawney.
Thank you. Ahead of COP26, the Government will publish a comprehensive net zero strategy which will form the basis of our next long-term strategy. The UK's NDC commits to an at least 68% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 levels, consistent with our legally binding commitment to net zero by 2050.
Let's head to Sir Oliver Heald. Sir Oliver.
Nature can be a great ally in tackling climate change, and as we restore salt marshes and peat bogs and other natural habitats, we can really make progress. But at the moment, only 3% of global climate finance is invested in nature-based solutions. So will she try to establish through COP26 a really reliable market in carbon credits, which have been generated by nature-based activity restoring habitats?
Mr. Speaker, we're promoting the restoration and protection of natural ecosystems through several different elements of COP26, facilitating agreement on Article 6, which relates to carbon markets, at COP26 is one of our top negotiating priorities. It can provide a framework for finance to be invested in climate action, including nature-based solutions, through international carbon markets and cooperation. And we are indeed world leading in the fact that the Prime Minister has set a £3 billion to be allocated to nature-based solutions from the UK's spending.
Yeah. We now have a substantive question to President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, we have made progress over the last year with net zero commitments from countries collectively accounting for 70% of global GDP. 75 world leaders announced climate commitments at the Climate Ambition Summit the UK hosted last December with the UN and France. However, as I said at the time, we still have some way to go, and 2021 will need to be a critical year for climate action.
Let's head to the Chair of the Select Committee, Neil Parish. Neil.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I congratulate the President on his new role and wish him well. Stopping deforestation in the tropics is crucial to reducing global carbon emissions, protecting biodiversity, and also the lands of local indigenous communities. However, UK firms, including several high street banks, have been found to invest heavily in businesses directly causing deforestation. Does my right honourable friend agree that the government should seek to expose and prevent these funding streams and encourage our COP26 partners to follow suit? Thank you.
President. Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend knows a great deal about these matters, and he makes an incredibly vital point about the incredibly valuable role of tropical forests. He will be aware that the UK is championing a new global task force on nature-related financial disclosures to tackle nature-related risks in investments.
We now go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Darren Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With many developing nations further behind in the rollout of their COVID vaccinations, what steps is the COP president taking to ensure that every nation on Earth is able to fully participate at COP26 in November?
President?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman raises an incredibly important point. We want this to be the most inclusive COP ever, and of course we are planning for this to be an in-person COP, taking into account contingencies as well. But he raised an important point about vaccines, because of course access to vaccines is not consistent globally, and of course we're going to work very hard to ensure that we have a safe and inclusive COP for all. I would just point out more generally that the UK, of course, is supporting the COVAX facility, is supporting CEPI, and the PM has recently made clear that we will send the majority of any future surplus that the UK has in terms of vaccine doses to the COVAX scheme to support developing countries.
Withdrawn, so a substantive question to President Sharma. Number 16.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first COP ever where we have set up an international civil society and youth advisory council, and indeed the next meeting of this group is later on today. I can tell him that it is co-chaired by two young climate activists, one from the global north and one from the global south. And I've also committed to meet civil society groups and youth groups in every country I visit, because I really want their voices to be front and centre at the heart of COP26.
Robert Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the appointment of my right honourable friend to his role, which underlines how seriously the government is taking its efforts to find international agreement on tackling climate change. Now, the scale of the challenge ahead of us requires us to be innovative and think outside of the box. I pay tribute to the work done by local groups such as Hope Valley Climate Action, Transition Buxton, Sustainable Hayfield, Acclimatise Whaley and Transition New Mills. Would the Minister be prepared to meet with me and these groups to hear their ideas for how we can work together to tackle climate change?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an incredibly important point because it is indeed local groups which are vitally important in terms of delivering many of the initiatives, actually not just in the UK, but around the world as well. And I want to pay tribute to him for his work in promoting climate action in his constituency more widely. In terms of meeting some of the organisations that he's referred to, of course I'll ensure that either I or members from the COP Unit Civil Society and Youth team will meet with those organisations in his constituency, particularly to hear their views.
We've got a substantive question again to President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, domestically the government has set out its 10-point plan, its energy white paper and an ambitious nationally determined contribution. And over the past year, the Prime Minister and I and other ministers and indeed officials have regularly engaged with counterparts across the world to raise climate action ambition.
Let's head to the southwest with Charlotte McCrory.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the President to his new position and I wish him every success. 2021 is a key year in our battle with climate change, and as we host COP26 as well as the G7 in Cornwall, climate change is such an important issue for constituents in Truro and Falmouth. So can my right honourable friend assure me that all areas of the UK, including Cornwall, will benefit from the developments that come from these two significant events as we recover from the COVID shock in a green and sustainable way?
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and of course it's very good news that the G7 is being held in Cornwall, which is, as we know, a powerhouse for green innovation. It's home to pioneering offshore renewables technology, as well as the first geothermal plant in the UK, and I'm sure it'll play an important role as we seek to build back better and greener across the whole of our country.
President Sharma, we now come to topicals.
Mr. Speaker, climate change is the biggest challenge faced by humanity. The world is on average already 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, and if we are to deliver on limiting temperature rises to below 2 degrees, indeed closer to 1.5 degrees, we must collectively act with the utmost urgency. Countries must commit to ambitious near-term emission reductions, set net zero targets, and donor countries must fulfil their commitments to the most climate vulnerable nations. Next month, the UK will host a Climate and Development International Ministerial meeting to make progress on key climate finance-related issues, and we want to ensure that the green thread of climate action runs through every international event on the road to COP26.
Right, let us head to Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr, Lefarydd, and I too welcome the Right Honourable Gentleman to his position as President. With Wales possessing the oldest housing stock in the UK, what lessons has he learnt from Welsh retrofitting schemes about the challenge of reducing residential emissions globally ahead of COP26?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, retrofitting, of course, is going to play an important role, and she will know that as part of the 10-point plan, we've also set out plans on greening our buildings and making them more energy efficient. She's raised a very specific point, and I will ensure that both the Business Secretary and indeed the Housing Secretary are made aware of it.
We're heading to Norwich with Clive Lewis. Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK's credibility as COP president rests on demonstrable climate action at home. And yet, much like the government's failed pandemic response, which has left 130,000 people dead, the government is acting too slowly, prioritising profit over public well-being. The government boasts about road building, cutting $1 billion from the public rail infrastructure budget and allowing the Cumbria coal mine to go ahead. Are plans simply not compatible with achieving net zero? So will the minister therefore admit that this government's stated ideological beliefs are incompatible with even its own meagre climate goals?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, I'd always thought that climate action was an area that we could collectively coalesce around without the need for political name-calling and fighting, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be possible for the Honourable Gentleman. I would just point him to the record of this government, but I'd also say to him that over the past 30 years, across a range of governments in the UK, we've managed to grow our economy by 75% and yet cut emissions by 43%. Green growth is possible, and that is what we're pursuing.
Shadow President Ed Miliband.
Thank you. I've never been called that before. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I warmly welcome the President to his full-time role. It's in all of our interests for him to succeed, and we want to do everything we can to help. The central judgment of COP26's success is whether it keeps the Paris target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees alive. To make that happen, the UN says we need to more than halve global greenhouse gas emissions from 52 gigatons today to 25 by 2030. So could he assure us that he recognises the scale of this challenge, the need for maximum ambition, and tell the House how close to that target he thinks we can get at COP26?
President Sharma.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in response to the Shadow President, may I just say that he raises a vitally important point. And we did make progress towards the end of last year. 70% of global GDP is now covered by a net zero target. But he's absolutely right when he alludes to the fact that what we need is near-term targets to 2030 in terms of cutting emissions. We're working very hard on that. And of course, I'm very happy to hear his thoughts on how we may be able to go faster.
Shadow President Miliband.
A crucial issue, Mr. Speaker, for the success of the COP is international finance for developing countries, as he knows, and they're facing poverty, the pandemic and climate change. Yet the government has shamefully chosen this moment to cut £25 to £30 billion from overseas aid over the course of this Parliament. Now, it says it is protecting climate aid, but it hasn't set out what that means year on year. So can he guarantee today that in this coming financial year, when the COP takes place, there'll be no cut to the level of the UK's climate finance budget, nor to the climate programmes we fund?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, what I would say to him is that, like him, I'm very proud of the work that successive governments have done in terms of supporting the most vulnerable around the world. But at 0.5% of GNI, the UK will still remain a leading international aid donor. And in relation to the issue of international climate finance, he will know that over a 5-year period, our commitment is 11.6 billion, which is indeed a doubling of the last figure.
Dr. Andrew Mason.
Will there be an opportunity in Glasgow to debate so-called energy from waste? In this COP presidency year, surely we should be doing nothing to encourage old-style great incinerators that pump effluent into the great landfill in the Skye in places like Westbury in my constituency. Surely to goodness, the waste hierarchy demands better than that.
Minister.
Thank you. I know and support absolutely the honourable member's concern, and I will pass it on, particularly in terms of the UK leadership, to the Minister for the Environment. The work that we have done already, setting the resources and waste strategy, is leading the way, and we are looking to eliminate all avoidable wastes by 2050 as a country. And of course, with so much of COP, it's about our leadership and proving that we are walking the walk by doing these policy changes here at home. So I will make sure that she continues to work on that with me.
Let's head north to Emma Hardy. Emma.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Zero Carbon Humber, our partnership which aims to build the world's first net zero carbon industrial cluster, managed to get that out, while creating high quality green jobs. So my question really simply is, will the President look kindly upon their submission of interest to be part of COP26?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, of course, I'm very positive to all of these initiatives around the country, but she refers to a matter which I think sits under the Business Secretary, and I'm sure when submissions come in, they will be looked at very carefully.
That brings the end to the questions. I will now come to Prime Minister's questions. I will first call the Prime Minister to answer the engagement question. I will then call Derek Twigg to ask his supplementary. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Let's head to the northwest with Derek Twigg. Derek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Halton Council ran out of funding for discretionary COVID isolation payments despite a strict criteria for eligibility. Just 171 constituents have been helped. The council have applied for further funding, but what the government have offered will not be enough. Other constituents fail to qualify for help due to the criteria set by his government. Will the Prime Minister look again at this and bring forward a properly funded scheme so that no constituent is in a position where they cannot afford to isolate? We need this to happen if we are to continue to drive down COVID-19 infections.
Prime Minister.
I thank him and I pay tribute to the work of everybody on Halton Council for everything that they've been doing throughout this pandemic. I know it's been very tough on council officials, indeed on everybody else. Central government's put in another £4.3 billion to help councils throughout the pandemic. We will continue to support our local authorities, and he'll be hearing more from the Chancellor next week.
Let's head across to Duncan Baker. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the UK is to become the Saudi Arabia of wind power, then it is off my coast of North Norfolk that is surely the capital. But the current piecemeal and environmentally damaging connection method to the national grid is holding us back, and this was proven by the Vattenfall judicial review just last week. We need legal and regulatory reform now. Prime Minister, could this be a job for the new Task Force for Innovation and Regulatory Reform to help us implement the much-needed offshore transmission network and meet our net zero targets?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, and I congratulate my honourable friend on his campaign to make his constituency the Riyadh or possibly the Jeddah of offshore wind, but I can tell him that we are certainly looking at the issue of the transmission network review, and we're in the process of developing the necessary regulatory changes.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The principles behind the Prime Minister's recovery plan of caution and it must be irreversible are plainly right. But one of the biggest threats to that is misinformation about the risks of the deadly virus. For example, there have been people saying that COVID statistics appear to have been manipulated, that Monday's roadmap is based on dodgy assumptions and false modelling. Does the Prime Minister agree that these kinds of comments are irresponsible and undermine our national recovery?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the roadmap that we've set out will, I believe, set us on a cautious but irreversible journey to freedom, and I'm glad that he supports the 4 steps of March the 8th for schools, April 12th for shops, May the 17th for hospitality, June the 21st for everything, and the data supporting all of that, Mr. Speaker, has been available to the House since I announced it on Monday.
I think the Prime Minister dodged that question, no doubt because all those comments came from his own MPs. some of the 60 or so members of the COVID recovery group. Perhaps the Prime Minister should have a word with them. Another big threat to the recovery plan is that around 3 in 10 people who should be self-isolating aren't doing so. That's a huge gap in our defences, and the small changes on Monday won't fix it. That's why Labour has called for the £500 self-isolation payment to be made available to everybody who needs it. Will the Prime Minister just fix this?
Mr. Speaker, he knows very well that those who are asked to self-isolate already have the £500 test and trace support payment, and I think he also knows, because he supported the roadmap on Monday, that he supports the fact the eligibility criteria are being extended to allow parents and guardians who are staying off work also to receive a payment, provided they meet the criteria. And I think he's aware of that.
Yes, Sir.
Mr. Speaker, 3 out of 10 people who should be self-isolating aren't doing so. That matters to millions of people, and it matters if we're going to get the virus under control. The chair of Test and Trace said that people are scared to come forward for a COVID test because they can't afford to isolate. That's the chair of Test and Trace, can't afford it. The government's biosecurity centre concluded that unmet financial need was why some lower income areas are seeing stubbornly high infection rates. So why, after all the billions the government has thrown around, is it still people in low-paid jobs who are at the bottom of this government's priorities?
Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I think most people looking at what we've done throughout this pandemic, looking at the support, the £280 billion package of support, can see that it is the poorest and the neediest in society, those on the lowest income, who have been the top of the government's priorities. And that is quite right. And we will continue to act in that way, Mr. Speaker, and he will be hearing more about that next week from the Chancellor, in addition to the discretionary funding we've given councils to support those who need it most, including those, Mr. Speaker, who have to self-isolate.
Yes, Sir.
Mr. Speaker, here's the difference. If you need £500 to isolate, you're out of luck. If you've got the Health Secretary's WhatsApp, you get a £1 million contract. Turning to next week's budget. Now, I don't expect the Prime Minister to preempt what's in the budget. If I want that, I can read it on the front page of the Times. But can the Prime Minister at least agree with me today that now is not the time for tax rises for families and for businesses?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know about you, but the budget is happening next week. It's not a date that is concealed from the right honourable gentleman. He knows when it's happening. He knows what to expect. But it's preposterous for him, Mr. Speaker, to talk about tax rises when he stood on a manifesto only a year ago, Mr. Speaker, or a little over a year ago, to put up taxes by the biggest amount in the history of this country. It is the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, his Labour council in Camden, that puts up taxes across the country. That is the way Labour behave, and it's thanks to prudent fiscal management by this government that we've been able to fight this pandemic in the way that we have.
Yes, Sir.
He wants to talk about tax rises. And he should, because this matters. Councils up and down the country are being forced to decide now whether to put council tax up. That's a £2 billion rise on families. I'm not blaming councils. They've been starved of funding for a decade. And Labour and Conservative councils are in the same position. For example, the Prime Minister might want to concentrate on his own constituency. His own council, Hillingdon, Conservative-run Hillingdon, is voting to increase council tax by 4.8%. Does the Prime Minister think that they're right to do that?
Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, Hillingdon Council, in common with most Conservative councils, has been running lower council taxes than Labour, up and down the country. He's completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to correct him. The top 10 highest council taxing councils in this country are run by the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker. And they are all going to put their taxes up Mr. Speaker, except for one in those top 10, which is Burnley, which is currently in no overall control, Mr. Speaker. And he talks about London and my own record on taxation. He should talk to the current Labour Mayor of London, who is putting up his council tax by 10%, because I can tell him that the previous Conservative Mayor of London, Mr. Speaker, cut council tax by 20%. That's what Conservative councils do.
Keir Starmer.
The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that £15 billion has been taken out of council budgets over the last 10 years. The Prime Minister stopped blaming others for the damage he's done, and he quotes the Mayor. This was the former Mayor who bought water can that can be used, spent millions on a garden bridge that never got built, and then more recently given a pay rise to Dominic Cummings. Mr. Speaker, this is another PMQs with yet again no answers. And the truth is this: the government spent a decade weakening the foundations of our economy and our country. As a result, we have the highest death toll in Europe. We have the worst recession of any major economy. Families are facing council tax rises and millions can't afford to self-isolate. And all the Prime Minister offers is a return to business as usual. Next week's budget is a chance to choose a different path, to build a stronger future, to protect families, to give our key workers the pay rise they deserve, and to back British businesses by supporting 100,000 new start-ups. Will the Prime Minister do so?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if you'll only wait till next week, I think you'll find that we'll do far more than that paltry agenda that he set out. Far more than that. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, it is quite mystifying to see the way the right honourable gentleman weaves hither and yon like some sort of druidical rocking stone, Mr. Speaker. One week he claims that he supports the vaccination rollout. The next week he actually attacks the vaccine task force when they're spending money to try to reach hard-to-reach vaccine-resistant groups, and says that kind of spending can't be justified. One week he calls for us to go faster with rolling out vaccines, when he would have stayed in the European Medicines Agency, which would have made that rollout impossible, Mr. Speaker. He vacillates, Mr. Speaker, we vaccinate. And we're going to get on with our agenda, cautious but irreversibly taking this country forward on a one-way road to freedom. And I very much hope that his support, which has been so evanescent in the past, will genuinely prove irreversible this time, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head to Yorkshire with Andrea Jenkins. Andrea.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's roadmap will provide many of my constituents in Morley and Outwood with a vision of hope for the future, that life will be set to return to a new normal before the end of June, and it'll allow us to celebrate the Great British Summer. Can the Prime Minister inform the House of the preemptive actions that the government is taking to spot, prevent and limit the damage of any future health emergencies, so that local economies in constituencies like mine have a sense of certainty that this will be their last lockdown?
Prime Minister.
Yes, she's quite right to raise the issue of local outbreaks and how to tackle them. And particularly with the threat of new variants, which she rightly raises. And that's why we have a very tough border regime, but also a programme as we go forward for surge testing, door-to-door testing, to ensure that when there is a local outbreak, we keep it local and keep it under control, as we're trying to do at the moment, as she knows, with the South African variant.
Let's head to Roskilde and Lochaber with the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week's budget gives the opportunity to tackle the financial costs of this pandemic. The UK has suffered its worst recession in 300 years. We now need a government that understands the scale of this crisis. Yet, at the very moment that the recovery needs maximum investment to recover, the Tories are threatening austerity cuts that will leave lasting scars in all our communities. Families have already seen their incomes slashed under this government, and now the Tories want to impose a public sector pay freeze and cuts to universal credit. So will the Prime Minister rule out a return to Tory austerity cuts and commit to a major fiscal stimulus of at least 5% of GDP, or will he threaten the recovery? and leave millions of people worse off?
Prime Minister.
I'm proud, Mr. Speaker, of the massive investments that the UK Treasury has made throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. £13 billion and more going to Scotland, huge sums going throughout the country. And I must say, I wish that the Scottish Nationalist Government would spend that money better. Because it's very sad to see some of the failures in education policy in Scotland, the failures in their criminal justice policy in fighting crime. And I think what the people of the whole UK would like to see, and I believe the people of Scotland, is less talk about a referendum, Mr. Speaker, which is his agenda, and more talk about the real issues facing our country.
Go back to Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is boasting, but the cold, hard reality is that the United Kingdom has suffered the worst slump of any major economy, and 120,000 people have lost their lives. That's under your guidance, Prime Minister. Coronavirus has exposed the deep inequalities under this broken Westminster system. After a decade of Tory cuts, millions of families are in poverty and UK unemployment is soaring. In contrast, in the United States, President Biden understands what is needed. He has proposed a $1.9 trillion stimulus package to restart and renew the American economy. Prime Minister, will your government follow the example of the US and boost the economy like Biden? Or is the Tory plan to return to type and impose yet another decade of Tory austerity?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this government is investing £640 billion in infrastructure alone throughout the UK. A massive programme to get our country rebuilt and restarted again. And I think that is what people would like to focus on, rather than his agenda to talk about our broken politics, our broken country. All they want to do is break up Britain with another referendum. And I think that is the last thing this country needs at the moment.
More.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, knows how important that the rail link between Southport and Manchester Piccadilly is for my constituents and those living in the wider Lancashire area. All of the changes put forward by the Manchester Rail Recovery Task Force are unacceptable. They would stop this service from happening and take our levelling up agenda off track. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss changes to these proposals so that we can keep this service and keep my constituents with the service that they've come to rely on and which is vital for their economy?
Prime Minister.
I congratulate my honourable friend for his campaign for better local transport, and we are investing massively in rail connectivity in his area, in local bus routes, and the particular line that he advocates, I know, is one of great interest to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Transport, and I will make sure that he has a chance to discuss it personally with him.
Let's go across to Ed Davey. Ed Davey.
Can I start by thanking the government for their change of policy announced today on the vaccination priority for people with learning disabilities, despite the Prime Minister's rather more equivocal answer to me on this last Monday? Mr. Speaker, today, millions of Uyghur people in China live in fear under a cruel regime. The BBC, international media, and human rights NGOs are all reporting on forced labour camps, women being raped and sterilised, and families being separated. This is a genocide happening in front of our eyes. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that unless China ends this genocide, Britain and Team GB should boycott the Winter Olympics in Beijing next year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to highlight the appalling campaign against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and that's why the Foreign Secretary, my honourable Foreign Secretary, has set out the policies that he has, the package of measures to ensure that no British companies are complicit in or profiting from violations. We're leading international action in the UN to hold China to account, and we'll continue to work with the US, friends and partners around the world to do just that. He raises a point about a sporting boycott. We're not normally in favour of sporting boycotts in this country, Mr. Speaker, and that's been the long-standing position of this government.
Let's head to North Cumbria with Dr. Neil Hudson. Dr. Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Penrith and the border struggles with poor broadband and phone signal connectivity, with download speeds around 56% of the UK average. Many of my constituents have been quoted large and unfeasible sums for new cables to be installed, which is often their only option to improve coverage. I welcome the potential of the shared rural network, the gigabit voucher scheme, and the universal service obligation to help. But what reassurance can my right honourable friend give my constituents that government is striving to address these broadband and phone signal not spots in rural Cumbria?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend and for all he does to campaign for the hardest to reach areas in rural Cumbria. And I know that we're doing all we can because I raise it virtually every day. And we are rolling it out as fast as we can. We've committed about £5 billion to connect those areas, £1 billion for the shared rural network agreement, and a voucher scheme to target predominantly rural areas. But we are intending to get everything we can possibly done in the next 5 years.
Let's head north to Dame Diana Johnson. Dame Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the 40% cut to transport for the North's budget part of the Prime Minister's plans for levelling up the North?
Prime Minister.
There's been no such cut, Mr. Speaker, and we intend to invest massively in Northern Powerhouse Rail, in railways in the north, and across the entire country.
Let's head to Susanna Webb. Susanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst hospitality has had to close their doors, in true Black Country spirit, many of my venues have been truly entrepreneurial and now offer a great takeaway service. To celebrate this entrepreneurial spirit, I am launching a favourite takeaway competition in my constituency today. Will the Prime Minister join me in launching this competition and also in a takeaway from the winning entry when he's next in wonderful Stourbridge? He'll receive a very warm welcome, and I'm happy to throw in a trip on the country's finest shuttle, which I hope soon to see, called the Stourbridge Dasher.
Prime Minister.
Yes, I congratulate my honourable friend. What she's doing to champion takeaways in Stourbridge, I'm not sure it'd be environmentally friendly for me to order a takeaway from Stourbridge in Westminster, but I thank her very much for her initiative, and I look forward to visiting the hospitality sector in her constituency as soon as possible.
West Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The education and well-being recovery of children from the pandemic is one of the biggest challenges facing our country. But we went into this pandemic with rising child poverty, a widening attainment gap, and school funding falling in real terms. So given that, does the Prime Minister really believe that the 43 pence per pupil per day announced today really cuts it? And if he does, would he really be happy to see that amount spent on his own children?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I passionately disagree with what he's just said about the spending that was going on even before the pandemic. We were increasing funding for primary schools for £4,000 per pupil, £5,000 for secondary school pupils, putting up starting salaries for teachers across the board to £30,000, a massive investment in education across the board, and in further education as well. And the catch-up funds now amount to £2 billion. But no, he's wrong. They amount to £2 billion, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we will have to do more, because this is the biggest challenge our country faces. And we will get it done. We're able to do it because we've been running a strong economy, and we had the resources to do it because we hadn't followed the bankrupt policies of himself and the party opposite.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Janine Maguire in my constituency, who is a mother of three, suffered a very unusual and unexpected and immediate cardiac arrest which saw her sadly pass away in February 2000. 20 years later, in August of last year, one of her daughters, Cara, suffered strangely the same fate with an unexpected cardiac arrest. Fortunately, Her friend Michael's with her, who was a former soldier and thus trained in first aid and life-saving. Despite her heart stopping for 20 minutes, he managed to save her life. In September of last year, the UK government made it mandatory for CPR skills to be taught in secondary schools, but despite a campaign and a letter from all of my Welsh Conservative colleagues, the Education Minister in Wales has declined to do so. Will my right honourable friend throw the weight of his office behind my campaign to have CPR skills taught in Wales so that the Maguire family and those like them no longer have to suffer in such tragic circumstances?
Well, I think the sympathies of the whole House will be with my honourable friend's constituent family and friends. And I agree with him very much about the importance of learning CPR. That's why we introduced it into the curriculum for all state-funded schools in England. It is, of course, a devolved issue, and I share his urgency that it also should be adopted in Wales as well.
Let's head to Lancashire with Rosie Cooper. Rosie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much focus of late has been on children returning safely to school. In my constituency, successive cohorts of pupils have had to wade through overflowing drains to get into school and are routinely evacuated from flooded classrooms. That takes a huge toll on the quality of their learning. Will the Prime Minister work again with Lancashire County Council and the head teacher of Town Green Primary School to ensure that no child in West Lancashire loses a vital day of education, especially to flooding-related issues?
Prime Minister.
I thank her very much. I sympathise very much with her constituents and the pupils who have to put up with disruption caused by flooding. I know that the Environment Agency continues to work very actively with the county council to resolve the issues, and that the DEFRA minister has written to her about what more can be done.
Let's head to Giles Watling. Giles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, my right honourable friend will know that pubs have been closing all over Britain for decades now, tearing the hearts out of communities. Now, this terrible pandemic has made things even worse, but part of the problem is undercutting by cheap supermarket booze. But now we're out of the EU, surely we can do as we please with beer duty. Differentiation in favour of on-sales could deliver great benefits to pubs in communities like Clacton, at nil cost to the taxpayer. Will my right honourable friend commit ministers to look at this differentiation proposal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he makes an extremely good point, which I'm sure will be heard with great interest around the country, and there is just such a review being carried out after consulting pub owners and brewers and others, and I know that the Chancellor is looking very closely at the findings.
Let's head north to Alex Cunningham. Alex.
Mr. Speaker, I was disappointed that the Prime Minister didn't accept my offer to meet with him when he recently visited my constituency's wonderful Fujifilm vaccine complex in Billingham to celebrate our local success story. I could have taken him to nearby Billingham Food Bank, where he would have learned that over a third of the children in my constituency live in poverty, and yet 2 in 5 of those same children are still not entitled to free school meals because the threshold is so low. Will the Prime Minister urgently address this scandal, take long-term action on universal credit and school meals, and help free our children from poverty?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly am proud of what universal credit is doing. Odd to be attacked by a Labour member over universal credit when it's his party's policy to abolish that benefit. But the best thing we can do for families in Billingham is ensure that there are very good jobs, and it was wonderful to see what's happening in Teesside under the leadership of Mayor Ben Houchen, the investment that is going in by Fujifilm and others, which will create long-term jobs, and it's the belief of this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, that that is the route out of poverty. It's fantastic education and top-quality jobs, and that's what this government aims to deliver.
Let's head to the southwest with Jack LaPresti. Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will recall from his visit in 2019 that the Port of Bristol will make an excellent location for a Great Western Freeport. And the West of England Mayor Tim Bowles has submitted a bid which could create 50,000 jobs in the region. Will the Prime Minister back our bid and also agree with me that with house prices in the West of England sitting at 9 times average earnings. We need a home building revolution to provide much more affordable housing for our young people as we build back better.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right in what he says about home building and about the need for housing across the country, because you sometimes hear that, oh, this is a problem just mainly in London and the South. It's not at all. It's everywhere in the country, as he rightly says. And I want to thank, by the way, Tim Bowles for what he's done, the mayor for the West of England, or everything that he has done now as he stands down. And we intend to help build on his legacy with a massive home building programme and home ownership programme, Mr. Speaker, across the country.
Let's head to Cumbernauld with Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart C.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before the budget is finalised, could the Prime Minister ensure that his Chancellor reads the Trussell Trust's new report, Dignity or Destitution, the case for keeping the Universal Credit Lifeline? His government has been incredibly generous to pals with PPE contracts, so surely, instead of cutting employment-related benefits to their lowest real terms level in 30 years, he must now afford some basic dignity to 6 million people on universal credit and make the uplift permanent.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to look after people throughout this pandemic and beyond, and the best thing we can do across the whole of the country is to bounce our economy back as fast as we can, get people into high quality jobs. As I said to the previous member, that is the agenda of this government.
Final question, Christian Wade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, for his announcement of a new high school for Radcliffe on the back of my campaign. This new high school will be the kickstart for regeneration that the town is desperately in need of. For towns like Radcliffe and Prestwich, which haven't received Towns Fund or future High Street funding, can my right honourable friend advise what assistance this levelling up government can provide to make sure these towns aren't forgotten?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my honourable friend for his successful campaign to get a new high school. It's absolutely vital. The best place for kids is in schools. I hope we'll hear from the Labour Party very shortly. And we are investing in his area, Mr. Speaker, to the tune of £660 million and more through the Local Growth Fund, £54 million through the Getting Building Fund, and of course also in the transport network. And next week the whole House will be hearing even more about what we propose to do to steer a path cautiously but irreversibly, Mr. Speaker, out of this pandemic and allow this economy to recover and to build back better across the whole of the United Kingdom.
I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable the necessary arrangements for the next business to be made. Order. Order. I call Rachel Reeves to ask her urgent question. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office if he will make a statement on the recent judicial review ruling which found that the government had acted unlawfully in respect of COVID contracts.
Minister Ed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Protecting those who protect us has been one of the government's most important goals in our fight against COVID-19. To do this, we've had to expand our PPE supply chain from supplying 226 NHS trusts in England to supplying over 58,000 different settings, and we've had to create a whole new logistics network from scratch. Thanks to the hard work and dedication of so many people, we've delivered over 8.6 billion items of PPE to the front line so far, with billions more ordered and being supplied. Our team worked night and day to procure PPE within very short timescales and against a background of unparalleled global demand. This often meant working at incredible speed, especially in the early months of the pandemic, to secure the vital supplies required to protect NHS workers and the public, which we did. Mr. Speaker, turning specifically to the High Court judgment, there has been a lot of confusion about what this ruling actually said and what it did not say, and I welcome the opportunity to clarify that to the House today. The High Court case did not look at the awarding of the contracts, but rather the timing of the publication of the details of contracts awarded. The Court ruled that at this time of unprecedented pressure, contract award notices were not all published in the timescales required by the regulations. However, the Court also found there was no deprioritisation policy in this respect within the Department. As we set out to the Court, the delays were caused by the workload involved in responding to one of the greatest threats to public health that this country has ever seen. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we take our transparency requirements very seriously, and it is important that I put on record that we, of course, take the judgment of the Court very seriously and respect it. We are working with colleagues across government to implement the recommendations set out in the Right Honourable Lady's report, the PAC report published earlier this month. But as we do this, we will keep acting quickly and decisively to respond to this deadly threat and to continue to do all that we can to help save lives.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A stain has emerged with this government's response to the crisis. There has been an unedifying gold rush of chums and of chancers. £2 billion worth of contracts handed to those with close links to the Conservative Party. From the pub landlord of the Health Secretary to the donors, the manifesto writers, the Old Boys Club, they've all had a return on their investment at all of our expense. The government has been taken to court and they lost, costing taxpayers even more money. Now, the Home Secretary once said that she wanted people to literally feel the terror at the thought of committing offences. Well, the Home Secretary doesn't have to look to the streets to find lawbreakers. She only has to look across the cabinet table. This government aren't terrified of breaking the law because they think they are above the law. Absolutely. But now the government have lost in court. So can I ask the Minister, what were the costs to taxpayers for fighting this case? Will the government agree today to publish the names of all businesses in their VIP fast lane and how they got on that list? Will all overdue contracts be published by the end of this week? When will the management consultants hired locate the billions of pounds of PPE that the government seem to have misplaced? And when will the clawback be used to get taxpayers' money back for contracts that have failed to deliver? And will the Minister take this opportunity to apologise to the doctors, the nurses, the care workers and other frontline workers who did not have the PPE that they needed and had to make makeshift PPE because, unlike what the Health Secretary has said, there was a shortage in PPE and those who were working on the front line were not protected. While he is here, will the Minister, as Serco's former head of public affairs, reveal the mystery of why the government created Serco Test and Trace rather than a true NHS Test and Trace embedded in our communities? Mr. Speaker, NHS workers, care workers and taxpayers deserve better. We deserve the end of crony contracts from this government.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, notwithstanding the circumstances and the approach adopted by the Honourable Lady, I will say it's a pleasure to appear at the dispatch box for the first time opposite her. She raised a number of specific points. But before I turn to them, I have to reiterate what this judgment in this case did and didn't do. This judgment focused on timely production or publication of contract notices. It did not make any judgment or consider in any way the appropriateness of the contracting process or any of the individual processes. In respect of her points, she alleges impropriety and inappropriate behaviour. Wrong. The NAO report was absolutely clear that there was no evidence of any inappropriate behaviour, and indeed no court has found this. I would highlight to her that the judgment was a declaratory judgment. It stated what had happened, that there had been a breach of the section of Regulation 50 requirements, and the judge, if I recall, subsequently highlighted in paragraph 149 of his judgment, but the overall picture shows the Secretary of State moving close to complete compliance. He goes on to say, the evidence as a whole suggests that the backlog arose largely in the first few months of the pandemic and that officials began to bear down on it during the autumn of 2020. I would remind the House, Mr. Speaker, and indeed the Honourable Lady, of the situation that we faced back in April. 3,301 people in mechanical ventilation beds, 21,307 people in hospital with COVID. And at the beginning of April, according to our best understanding of positive cases at the time, the average number of positive cases and patients in hospital was doubling every 7 days. In those circumstances, I make no apologies that the government did everything in its power to ensure the NHS and frontline workers did not run out of PPE. And as the NAO has acknowledged, there was no national shortage of PPE at that time and throughout this pandemic. The Honourable Lady raised a number of other questions. She talked about the current situation in terms of publication and compliance and cost. What I would say to her, and I did briefly mention this to her before, is that there is an element of this case that is yet to be concluded, which is due to be on Friday when information is provided to the judge. We are doing exactly that, and that will be made public at that time when it goes to the court, respecting the role of the court in this process. But of course, the judge, I would expect, would make that published in a couple of days' time. In terms of the priority route, I know, well, indeed, if I recall correctly, I think many members of this House from both sides requested expeditious consideration of requests or offers of help. I am grateful to all who offered their help. Every one of those went through an 8-stage process run by civil servants, entirely appropriately checking appropriateness of the PPE, appropriateness of the organisation to supply it, and conducting due diligence. Indeed, if I recall, the Honourable Lady herself on the 22nd of April published a letter that she sent to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, helpfully analysed at the time by the Guido Fawkes website, sharing some of her suggestions for companies or individuals that should be put through rapid assessment. And I acknowledge she said for assessment and due diligence, but she asked that they be assessed rapidly. I believe many members of this House took the same approach. But in that letter, the Honourable Lady concluded by saying, we need government to strain every sinew and utilise untapped resources in UK manufacturing to deliver essential equipment to frontline workers. This must be a national effort which leaves no stone unturned. She was right. I agreed with her sentiment then, and I still do. My only challenge is that the Honourable Lady no longer appears to agree with herself, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I think we understand the point is the judgment over the timescale and not meeting the regulation for all the contracts. I think that it would be good for the House to hear how far the supply of PPE equipment now comes from this country rather than from abroad. And can I put it to the Minister that were I a Minister myself, an official said, we can either get more ventilators, more PPE, or we can make sure we don't fail any of the regulation timescales, I'd have said, I as the Minister will take responsibility for the failure on the timescales, and you can take responsibility for getting the equipment that people need.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. In respect of his first question, at the start of this pandemic, roughly 1% of the PPE used in this country, in this setting, was produced in this country due to the incredible effort by businesses and individuals across this country, and I have to say, by civil servants and officials in government who are often the unsung heroes of this pandemic. That is now up to 70% being supplied by this country. And he's absolutely right. Of course transparency is important. Transparency is hugely important, and we respect that and take it very seriously. But I make no apologies for the thing which I consider, the Secretary of State considers to be most important, which is doing whatever is necessary to save lives in the course of this pandemic.
Let's head to SNP spokesperson Stuart Halsey. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Minister mentioned transparency, because of the £15 billion of PPE contracts awarded up until last October, barely £3 billion were properly published. And we had £252 million given to a finance company, £108 million to a confectionery supplier, £345 million to a pest control company. A catalogue of cronyism described variously as a wholesale failure, a dismal failure, and a historic failure. A process which deprioritised compliance and has ended up with the taxpayer, in some cases, buying expensive, unusable PPE. Now, ultimately, the Cabinet Office is responsible for the coordination of the cross-government response to COVID-19. So let me ask this Minister, when was the Minister for the Cabinet Office, and indeed the Prime Minister, first made aware that failure to properly publish details of PPE contracts might be unlawful?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He will appreciate that some of the contracts, which some colleagues have alluded to, remain subject to separate litigation before the courts. Indeed, some by the Good Law Project, which, if I may, I suspect it may come up a number of times, I'll refer to as the GPL project, because it might save a few minutes in these answers. So I hope you will understand I will avoid straying into something that may still be before the courts, because I don't want to show any disrespect for that process or for the legal process. He talked about the number published and where we've got to now. That will be some of the information put before the judge on Friday, as per his request. But the latest figures that are in the public domain that were supplied and covered in the judgment, and indeed more broadly, I think 100% of the CANS notices have been published, and I think we're up to 99% under Regulation 108, and the latest figures I have. So as the judge said, the overall picture does show the Secretary of State moving close to complete compliance. In respect of his broader point, I would expect that ministers in both my department, which is why I'm here, but also ministers in the Cabinet Office will have followed this process very closely.
William Bragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in welcoming my honourable friend to the dispatch box, I hope that the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster wasn't too indisposed cooking up plans for domestic COVID passports that he's previously ruled out than to attend the House today. But I think most fair-minded people will look at this situation in the round and perhaps give the government the benefit of the doubt, because the judgment found against the allegation of secret deprioritisation policy to deliberately breach procurement rules. And further to the question from our honourable friend, the Father of the House, can my honourable friend give greater detail of the extent of the increase in domestic production of PPE in this country so that we have security of the supply?
Minister.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. I believe that officials did do the right thing in prioritising getting the PPE that we needed for our front line. And he's absolutely right to highlight an aspect of Justice Chamberlain's judgment, which found there was no policy of deprioritising the publication of contracts notices and contract data. To his final point, yes, I said to the Father of the House, we've moved from a 1% domestically produced amount of PPE to 70% now. And to put that in context, we've supplied 8.6 billion items, and we've got over 30 billion on order or being supplied at present. I suspect, albeit as a history teacher, as a former teacher, his mental arithmetic is probably more rapid than mine in calculating that proportion as an absolute number, but I hope it illustrates to him just how much we've moved in the past year to utilise the fantastic resource that we have in manufacturing in this country.
To Sarah Owen. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID contracts continue to literally be a matter of life and death, so the public are right to expect accountability and transparency. While nurses wore bin bags instead of proper PPE, contracts were handed out to ministers' mates. So will the minister do the right thing and in the very least reveal the 29 businesses Serco outsourced their operations to?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear, and as I highlighted earlier, the NAO has been exceptionally clear that there are no suggestions of ministers behaving inappropriately in any way in the award of these contracts. And the judge did not find that in this case. It was not a factor in this case. We've been very clear to her broader point that we do believe and we fully respect transparency requirements, and we are publishing, and we have done, as I illustrated with those figures, the latest figures I put out earlier, that the department is publishing the contracts it has, and as the judge said, and I come back to it once again, the Secretary of State is moving close to complete compliance, and that is exactly what we will continue to do.
Let's head up to Lancashire with Anthony Higginbotham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At the height of the pandemic last year, the priority of the whole country was getting PPE to where it was needed on the front line. And I know I received offers of help from many businesses that I fed into the department. Could the Minister confirm, though, how many items of PPE have been delivered because of these contracts that came in over the course of last year?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. As I've said, 8.6 billion items of the contracts that were secured by the department since the start of the pandemic have been delivered, and around 3 times that number has been ordered to ensure that we continue to have delivered a robust supply to do what is the most important thing in this situation, which is to ensure that our frontline health and social care and other workers have the PPE they need to protect them.
Let's head down to Caroline Lucas. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Both the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister have repeatedly claimed that all the information relating to PPE and other COVID contracts is published online. So can you tell us very specifically where to find details about the VIP lane, including who the entrants were, what prices they were paid, and who introduced them? And on behalf of the government, will he apologise to numerous NHS and care staff who have been deeply upset by comments made by the Health Secretary yesterday, echoed in fact by himself today, that there wasn't a shortage of PPE? Does he understand why that is so insulting to the doctors who were forced to wear bin bags in the absence of gowns, and to the nurses who were wearing goggles from Screwfix?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. As I highlighted to her, we are at 100% compliance on the CAN notices. That is what the Prime Minister was referring to, the obligation to publish, and that is what we have done. And I would notice, I appreciate her interest in this case. Although the judge ruled she had no standing to bring the case, I do appreciate her long-standing interest in this matter. In respect of her points about the supply of PPE, as the NAO report highlighted, we did not run out of PPE nationally. That is not to say that there were not significant challenges in some hospitals, in some areas, around the distribution of that PPE, and that has been acknowledged throughout this pandemic. Our frontline health and social care workers did an amazing job in very challenging circumstances, and that is why it is right that civil servants across my department and others worked flat out, day and night, doing an amazing job to get the PPE that was needed. And just a final point, if I may, to the Honourable Lady. I do recognise, and I know this is very important to her, the importance of transparency and timely publication of the data. But I would also say that I would highlight the view of one of her own Green councillors in Brighton and Hove, who in a written answer recently highlighting that that councillor failed to publish its financial spend figures, I think, since last June, highlighting, and I quote in that answer, they have, quite rightly, his officials, prioritised paying our suppliers and producers as quickly as possible and prioritised payment of suppliers over production of information.
I think we need to try and keep to the questions and not score points. Let's go to Aaron Bell, who won't want to score a point. Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as my right honourable friend just did, I note from the judgment that Mr. Justice Chamberlain found that the 3 members of Parliament who sought to join this case did not have standing. He stated at paragraph 107, quotes, "In a case where there is already a claimant with standing, the addition of politicians as claimants may leave the public with the impression that the proceedings are an attempt to advance a political cause." So would my honourable friend agree with me that this recent practice of trying to extend politics through court cases is actually becoming quite damaging to our democracy as a whole, particularly when technical judgments are then deliberately misrepresented, as seems to have happened in this case?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I, as a former Justice Minister, have huge respect for the legal process and indeed for the judgment of the courts. But he is right to highlight once again the point that the judge made in his finding that the members of this House who sought to bring this case had no standing in doing so, and that it was the GPL project that did. While I appreciate members of this House feel strongly on this issue, and understandably so, I would echo his point that I would hope that they would not seek to use the courts to make political points rather than to use them for what they are there for, which is to highlight legal issues.
Let's head over to Bell Rabira-Waddy. Bell?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The scandal surrounding COVID contracts has not just been in the lack of transparency, but in the poor performance of these companies. 350 million to Pestfix for PPE that didn't meet the required standards, another 347 million to Randox, having failed on their original $133 million contract for distributing test kits that weren't sterile. And of course, the millions to Serco and others who failed with the track and trace system. Does the Minister agree that all public sector contracts should be held to the highest standard, no matter who their friends are? And will he outline what plans the government has to hold such contractors to account and recoup millions of public money? Or will he uphold these standards, also depending on whether the contractors have links to the Conservative Party?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, to her first point, a number of specific cases relating to specific contracts remain before the court. So if I may, I'll address her broader point about pursuing the appropriateness of the contracts, whether they can deliver, and where they fail to deliver to the appropriate standards or not, what steps the government will take. All contracts were assessed against the 8 criteria for appropriateness, including due diligence, including safety standards, including whether they meet the specifications, etc., etc. Any contract that did not deliver against that, we either refuse to pay or we will be seeking to recoup that money, and a number of investigations are already underway to fulfil that, that commitment. The Honourable Lady also touched on, and forgive me, I should have answered this when the Shadow Minister mentioned it, so I hope she will forgive me for coming back to it now. She touched on and made a very particular point about Serco in this context. I would just make one point to her, which I hope she will be aware of, and I'm sure she wasn't suggesting anything to the contrary. As was made very clear on the Today programme last year, I had no involvement with those contracts in any way, shape or form. Although I left the company 7 years ago, although I was never a director of that company, and although I have no ongoing links with it, so there would have been no conflict, I nonetheless had no involvement at any point in any level with those contracts, and I continue to adopt that position. I hope that's helpful to her in clarifying that point.
Right, let's head up to Stoke-on-Trent with Jonathan Gullis. Jonathan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British people want us to fight, keep on fighting this virus, protecting our NHS, and as we roll out the vaccine and save lives. So does my honourable friend agree that the sniping from the sidelines, as the Labour Party is doing, is the opposite of what the people of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk want to see right now in these unprecedented times?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise that all members of this House and all members of the public and our constituencies want to see, and quite rightly so, transparency, but I think what is most important to them in the midst of this pandemic and as we emerge from this pandemic is that this government and those who work for it have done everything they can to ensure that we procured the PPE that was necessary, when it was necessary, to protect the front line and help save lives.
Let's head to Oxford with Layla Moran. Layla.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, whether I had standing or not, I am proud to have helped bring this case alongside the members of Brighton Pavilion and Oldham East and Saddleworth. And the reason we did it was because we couldn't get the information through the normal channels available in this place. It's also worth noting that the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, rather than simply admit the breach and then promptly publish all contracts at the beginning of the process, chose to push the case to court. And then when he lost, he said he would break the law again. At the heart of the case was always transparency and fairness. Many established businesses felt frozen out because they happened not to be chums with a parliamentarian or a minister. So my question is this: can the minister not see how this looks, but also how delays in publishing these contracts in good time further undermines trust in government at a time when trust, as much as PPE, is necessary for saving lives?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Honourable Lady, and I hope she heard me highlight that although I made the legal point about lack of standing, I did acknowledge that she and two other honourable members clearly had an interest in this, and I did acknowledge her long-standing interest in this issue, in this case. She's right to highlight trust, and I think what is central to trust with the British public is the government doing everything it can to deliver for our frontline workers the protection they needed to make sure they could keep protecting us safely. The Secretary of State highlighted at the weekend, and I think this is the latest figure, that on average, the publication of notices was on average 17 days over the 30 days required, is the latest figure that the Secretary of State highlighted. I do believe it's important that transparency is adhered to, but I would also remind the Honourable Lady, I believe it's extremely important to highlight why this happens, and that is why we filed the court papers and we defended the case as we did, because I think it is hugely important for the court to see why this occurred. The government continues to do what I believe the public would expect us to do, which is on focusing on protecting the front line.
Go to Yorkshire with Craig Whittaker. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many excellent companies in the Calder Valley who wouldn't normally bid for government contracts have stood up for the national effort and have been making PPE for the national cause, even when this isn't their core business. This has secured jobs, secured business, and ensured our NHS has had the PPE when they needed it. Can my honourable friend confirm that all these and other government contracts are awarded in a fair, open and transparent way, following due process, and that this government has remained committed to publishing them as quickly as possible, even under the pressures of the pandemic?
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I, like him, pay tribute to all those businesses and individuals who stepped up in this country's moment of need and were willing to put themselves forward to repurpose their factories, to try to find ways to help that national effort. All the contracts have been found so far to be awarded entirely appropriately. There has been no adverse judgment in respect of any of that. And indeed, under Regulation 32, which highlights that in an emergency, contracts can be awarded without tender, I certainly would take the view that the situation we faced with this pandemic would certainly constitute a national emergency.
Let's go to Livingston with Anna Bardell. Anna.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell me if it's coincidence, incompetence or just rank stupidity that his government and health secretary awarded a £30 million contract for testing vials to the health secretary's former neighbour, who was a former pub landlord and had no experience in this field and is now being investigated by the MHRA? And surely he agrees that these breaches mean the health secretary must resign.
Mr. Speaker, well, the Honourable Lady will not be surprised to know that I completely and utterly disagree with her. I think my right honourable friend has done and continues to do an extraordinary job under extraordinary pressure over the past year to help this country through this pandemic. She raised a very specific issue, and it has been made clear that the Health Secretary and no other minister had any involvement in the assessment, the due diligence or any decisions in respect to that contract.
Let's head to Sir Robert Neal. Sir Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The judge very clearly found that there was a breach in relation to one matter, the 17-day average delay. He rejected the suggestion that there was a systematic failure. He rejected the suggestion that there was any impropriety in the system for awarding the contracts, and did not impugn any of the contracts themselves either, or the process by which they were awarded. Most lawyers would know that was a technical breach, as has been described, albeit a breach. Isn't the real moral of this that when those of us in politics seek to comment upon judgments, it's a good idea to actually read the judgment first and understand the law about which it's based, rather than grandstanding very inaccurately, as too often been the case here?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable and learned friend, I believe, for his comments. He's absolutely right to highlight what this judgment actually said. It found in what had to be a binary judgment, either it was complied with or it wasn't, that the government failed to comply with the 30-day publication timing for all contracts. But you're right, he absolutely... sorry, I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. He rejected the suggestion of any policy of deprioritisation, and he's also absolutely right. I read the 40 pages of Justice Chamberlain's judgment, including the setting out of the different cases put by the two parties, the discussion of it, and then, crucially, his findings on it. And I would advise all members who take an interest in this issue to do exactly the same thing, because legal judgments are rarely as clear-cut or as simple as perhaps some commentators and others might wish to suggest.
Said no to Chiomara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's infatuation with private sector delivery of pandemic public services has led it to ignore basic procurement best practice, replacing value for money with cronyism and due diligence with pub pals. Will the government commit, as Labour has done, to a programme of insourcing and start by handing over the failing Serco test and trace to the public sector, which has made such a success of the vaccine delivery?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. To her main point about private and public, and indeed I might add voluntary sector organisations, every one of those has stepped up and made a hugely important contribution to our response as a country to this pandemic. I would wish to pay tribute to public sector organisations. I spent 10 years as a councillor and I entirely recognise the amazing work they do. I would pay tribute to private sector organisations who have also stepped up for our country, and of course voluntary sector organisations. For me, it is not an either or, it is both, and what delivers the best outcome for the public. Anything less would, in my view, be letting down our constituents and letting down our public services.
Let's go to Angela Richardson. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the height of the pandemic, the contracts we signed allowed us to stand side by side with the private sector, procuring enormous volumes of goods and expertise with extreme urgency. Does my honourable friend agree that without these vital contracts, our COVID response would have suffered as a result?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree entirely. I mean, it reminds me slightly, some of the narrative around this, of my days back at school and Animal Farm, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. The reality is both private sector and public sector have played an incredible role in tackling this pandemic, for which we should be extremely grateful and thankful. We need both, and we need both to continue delivering in the public interest, which is what we have secured.
Let's go to Manchester with Debbie Abrahams. Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a couple of points that seem to be coming up from this discussion. First of all, that there were no shortages of PPE. Well, patently, that's not true. We have clear evidence that that's the case, not least from exercise sickness back in 2016, but also from, for example, local constituents who have been working in the NHS who have reported this directly to me and colleagues. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, that the government has published all the contracts, and the Minister has made reference to 100% contract award notices being published. Well, unfortunately, we're not able to verify this. And that is the key point, also made by the NAO, who said that there's still £4 billion worth of contracts since November 2020, which we have no idea who they have gone to, how much for. So will the Minister once again please commit to publishing these VIP contracts, how much they were for, who were they awarded to, and what for?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she and I have known each other a long time. She makes her point forcefully, but as ever, fairly. She raises a number of points in respect of PPE supplies, and as I made clear, I think, to the Honourable Lady for Brighton Pavilion, I made very clear that in the NAO report, I believe it was last November, they said there was no, it did not run out nationally, but that is not, as I've clarified, to say that there weren't local shortages and challenges in individual trusts, as I acknowledged to the Honourable Lady, the member for Brighton Pavilion, and that is why we procured as much as we could, as quickly as we could. She raised the issue of exercise sickness. I do have to say this comes up a number of times. However, it's important to remember exercise sickness did not look at tackling a novel COVID or a novel pandemic. It looked at flu, it looked at influenza specifically. The PPE required for dealing with a disease of the nature of COVID is very different to that for flu, and that exercise had as one of its predicated actions the swift arrival of antivirals to be delivered to tackle the flu. They did not exist in the case of COVID until much later. So it's important we learnt from it, but we should be careful about reading directly across as it's representing a blueprint for how to tackle a pandemic of this sort. And her final point about transparency, as I've made clear, the government remains committed to transparency and to the publication of contracts as required under the regulations.
Right, let's head to Lincolnshire with Holly Mobbycroft. Holly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the height of the first wave of the pandemic, we looked to the government to procure and to distribute tens of thousands of critical items of PPE in Scunthorpe. Does my honourable friend agree with me that moving forward, the government should of course remain committed to following all the detail of procurement rules? However, protecting our frontline health workers should always come first.
I agree entirely with my honourable friend. It shouldn't have to be an either-or, but we all remember the conditions in which our amazing civil servants were working at pace back at the start of this pandemic. They were working flat out, including, as acknowledged in the court papers, civil servants who were not DHSC civil servants. They were seconded in from other departments working on different systems just to get that PP ordered and delivered to protect the front line, which was the priority. So it shouldn't be an either-or, but she's absolutely right. At the height of that first wave, I believe it's absolutely right that the focus of those dedicated officials was on getting the PPE we needed.
Right, let's head to Wales with Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. I'm not an expert in public procurement, Mr. Speaker. However, even in an emergency, I would expect diligent contracts would include full payment on delivery clauses or clawback measures for failure to supply. He mentioned in an earlier reply that the British government is pursuing contractors who have failed to meet their obligations. How much public money has been regained to date? And will he ensure the House is updated on the government's efforts on recouping misspent public money?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right to highlight that where contracts do not deliver, either to standard or do not deliver, then public money should either not be paid or should be recouped. We are going through a number of investigations at the moment to deliver exactly that, and I am quite happy to commit that at the appropriate juncture we will, of course, update the House.
Let's head to Henley with John Howell. John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister accept that illegal acts are those that contravene the law, unlawful acts are those that contravene the rules? So handball in soccer is unlawful, not illegal. And will he accept the point made by the chairman of the Justice Select Committee that this is a technical breach and that it has been overcome and that the department is going out of its way to make sure that it happens quickly?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suspect I can do no better than to quote the judgment which stated that in respect of Regulation 50, the government acted unlawfully, but he's absolutely right to highlight the fact that, again, as the judgment set out, the Secretary of State is almost at complete compliance, and that is exactly what the government is committed to.
Let's head to the North East with Liz Twist. Liz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government claims that this is just a case of a few PPE contracts published a couple of weeks late, but in fact we know that hundreds of millions of pounds worth of contracts also went to management consultants. So can the Minister confirm whether all these contracts, missing the publishing deadline at the start of the pandemic and up until now, were in fact for PPE, or whether they also included contracts that have gone to private consultants? And can you explain why those contracts were not published on time?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My understanding, in response straight answer to the Honourable Lady's question, is that this data relates to all contracts by the Department. If I am inaccurate in that, I will of course correct the record for the House, but my understanding is that this data refers to all contracts by the Department itself.
Let's head down the river to Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that all government contracts are awarded in a fair, open and transparent way, following the correct due process, and that this government remains committed to publishing them as quickly as possible, even under the pressure of this pandemic? And does he agree with me that the public are much keener that we address the real issues of the pandemic rather than engaging in political point scoring?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I couldn't agree with my honourable friend more, both about the government's commitment to transparency and to publishing contracts within the regulations, but equally his point about and reminding everyone about where we were a little under a year ago and the absolute focus by so many amazing and dedicated civil servants on getting the PPE we needed and getting it in quantity.
Right, let's head to Midlothian with Owen Thompson. Owen.
Mr. Speaker, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime says in its Recover with Integrity campaign that emergency responses must be anchored in law and be implemented by strong public institutions with the involvement and oversight of members of Parliament, anti-corruption bodies, civic society and private sector. It's clear honourable members have numerous questions over these contracts. So will the Minister now advocate such action, such as backing my ministerial interests emergency powers bill, to make sure Parliament can scrutinise the government's actions and that members of this House and the public can be confident that there is no suggestion of any corruption taking root?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I would refute any suggestion that there is any corruption taking root, to quote his own words. Members of this House have the ability to ask questions. The NAO has the ability to ask questions. The Honourable Lady will, I suspect, ask me a question in a moment, but also has the ability to ask questions. And I believe her committee on the PAC took evidence for over 3.5 hours last December from various senior officials in the department. I'm aware of the Honourable Gentleman's bill, which I'm sure the government will look at in the usual way.
Right, let's head up to Lancashire with Scott Benton. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the start of this pandemic, the British people rightly expected the government to leave no stone unturned in securing the vital supplies of PPE which were needed to fight the pandemic. Does the Minister agree that whilst we were in the grips of a global shortage of PPE, the findings from the National Audit Office make clear that no health trust ran out of supplies at any point, and that this was thanks to the contracts which the government managed to secure?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and we did take every step we could to ensure that trusts had the PPE they needed. And the quote, I believe, from the NAO report is that they said, the NHS provider organisations we spoke to told us that while they were concerned about the low stocks of PPE, they were always able to get what they needed in time.
During the PAC, regularly.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I will touch on that point first, which was going to... In paragraph 18 of the summary, it summarises exactly as the Minister has said. It then goes on to say, however, frontline workers reported shortages of PPE. And I think it does not behove the Minister well to come to this House and clearly to have backbenchers briefed about a partial element of the National Audit Office's report that is partial and inaccurate when taken in the round. The Minister needs to deal with this point. But my bigger point is that on the transparency of these contracts,
The minister's come to this House to talk breathlessly about the urgency at the early stage of the pandemic. Let's be clear, by the end of the summer and the autumn, many of these contracts had still not been published. The civil service is usually good at record keeping and transparency. On this occasion, there was a failure. The minister should have the guts to come to the House, apologise and promise it will not happen again. More transparency, not less, is vital when billions of pounds is being spent ad haste in a pandemic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she does know this issue exceptionally well. She's investigated it over a number of months. So, of course, as always, I listen to what she says very carefully and with considerable respect. On her first point, she is right that they reported that frontline workers, or some frontline workers, had told them that they had experienced shortages. We are reflecting what we were told by our trusts and by those running the delivery of PPE in those, and what the NAO was told by those. But as she alluded to, and as I said, I think in response to the Honourable Lady for Brighton Pavilion, the key points I made were there was no we did not run out of PPE nationally, but there were challenges, which I acknowledged, and I do acknowledge, at some individual trusts and in some localities, and that is why we worked at pace to make sure they got what they need and they didn't run out of PPE. But that is exactly why officials in the department were working so hard and pulling out all the stops to make sure we ordered more PPE and got more PPE delivered. Her broader point about transparency, she makes, of course, an absolutely vital point. Transparency, and I think it was the Honourable Lady, the member for Oxford West and Abingdon, who highlighted trust. Trust is always the currency of politics. It is always the one thing which everyone requires in government, in this House. And it's important that that is fostered by as much transparency as possible. The judgment found that in a number of cases, the government did not meet the 30-day deadline. She asks for an assurance now. I can give her the assurance the government is doing everything it can to ensure that Regulation 50 is complied with and complied with fully.
I said to the southwest with Selene Saxby. Selene.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The British people want us to focus on fighting this virus so we can protect our NHS as we roll out the vaccine and save lives. Does my right honourable friend agree that the political sniping some of the opposition is engaging in is the exact opposite of what people expect and want to see politicians doing?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think what my constituents, what the British public would want to see us all doing is working together to make sure we get through this pandemic and we get our front line what they need to keep them safe.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 60,000 pub landlords in this country, and many of them have lots to give in a time of crisis. But isn't it a coincidence that the one who gets a massive contract happens to be the one who has the mobile phone number for the Health Secretary? There are hundreds of racehorse owners in this country. Isn't it funny that it just so happens the one who gets a top job without the need for an interview happens to be a mate of the Health Secretary? And on it goes. If this behaviour was going on in a developing world country, there would be howls of corruption from Tory benches and demands for the aid budget to be cut. Isn't it true that when it comes to jobs for friends, dodgy contracts, and all the rest of it that's been going on and is normalised by this government and the Tory party has a blind spot?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I have, again, huge respect for the honourable gentleman, and he's normally measured and tempered. I fear on this occasion he slightly doesn't do himself justice in the points he makes. As I've made clear already and has been made clear, all contracts that were ordered were assessed by an 8-stage process run by the civil service, checking due diligence, checking appropriateness, checking ability to deliver, checking price, and not by ministers. And in respect to the very specific one he mentioned, it has been made clear that the Secretary of State had no involvement in the award of that contract or its assessment.
28 withdrawn, so we go into John MacDonald. John.
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole tenor of the discussion today demonstrates the need for greater transparency, as the Minister has said, and one way of doing that is to extend freedom of information to include all companies engaged in publicly funded contracts. But Mr. Speaker, I'm confirmed about the data contract signed with the US data company Palantir, notorious for its links with Trump and the white supremacist far right. Can the Minister confirm whether this contract has been the subject to a data protection impact assessment, including a public consultation, and whether Palatine will be able to sell on NHS data at a later stage, even, for example, to the Conservative Party for electoral purposes?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I won't stray near the wilder accusations made by the right honourable gentleman there. What I will say to him is that the data of NHS service users is always protected by this government.
Right, let's head up to Bob Blackman. Bob.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm a great believer in competitive tendering to gain the right sort of value for money for the public sector. But at the height of this, for the first wave of the pandemic, my local hospital, Northwick Park Hospital, came perilously close to being overwhelmed by both the number of patients and only literally having 1 day's supply of PPE within the hospital. Thanks to government actions and the Department of Health and Social Care, that was remedied. What does my honourable friend think would have happened if the government had decided to competitively tender all these items and wait for potentially 3 months before supplies were available?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend highlights both the work of his fantastic hospital at Northwick Park, but also, as I alluded to in response to the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the fact that while nationally we did not run out of PPE, there were some real challenges at a number of sites. They did an amazing job to ensure that they had the PPE they needed. I believe the minimum time it can take to run a tender is around a month. So I certainly, for one, would not have wished to see us waiting a month, not utilising Regulation 32, but waiting a month to order and secure the PPE that his hospital and those working in it needed.
Right, let's head to Ruth Jones. Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Newport West have looked at the media reports, the court judgments and the answers given in this House on this matter with horror. There appears to be no respect for honest law-abiding citizens who play by the rules, and that is unacceptable. So when will government ministers finally show they respect the will of the people and the ruling of the courts and stop this reckless behaviour?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've already made clear that I and ministers always respect the courts and the judgments delivered in them. I also have great respect and recognise the importance of transparency. But what I would say to her is I also respect the need, which our constituents would expect us to do, to deliver rapidly on the PPE that was needed last year at the height of the pandemic. I think that's what they would have wanted us to be focusing on at that time as we cast our mind back. And to a final point, yes, I'm quite happy to recommit the government, restate the government's commitment to the importance of transparency.
32 withdrawn, so we'll go to Howell Williams. Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Using the VIP lane, a PPE contract of £313 million was awarded to PestFix, a company that had never before supplied medical PPE. To put this fantastical sum into perspective, a free school meal every day for a year for every child in Wales in a family getting universal credits would cost £101 million, less than a third of the sum gifted to PestFix. Given the Minister's unapologetic replies so far, does he even begin to understand why the perception of his government's default cronyism has angered so many people?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I won't comment on specific cases because I mentioned at the beginning some are still subject to actions before the courts, and I don't want to cut across those legal processes. The broader point I would make is that I think people will understand that this government and the unsung heroes of this pandemic, the civil servants, the officials who worked throughout it, have pulled out all the stops to do what was necessary and what was essential to procure the PPE that, if we look back those 10 months or so, was the most pressing issue in this country to ensure our frontline workers got the protection they needed.
Let's head to David Simmons. David.
Mr. Speaker, when I reflect on my inbox of just nearly a year ago, my constituents were expressing huge anxiety from nursing homes to medical establishments about access to personal protective equipment. So Will my honourable friend accept the thanks of my constituents for having acted so swiftly to ensure that the necessary and essential equipment got where it needed to be? And does he share my frustration that that success is being overshadowed by, frankly, dubious attempts to muck rake in respect of the process that was undertaken?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The equipment was procured, it was secured, and it was delivered. It did what we would all wish it to do, was it went to the front line to protect them and to ensure that hospitals and trusts did not run out of PPE at that crucial point in the first wave. And I think he's absolutely right to highlight what I believe the British public would wish to see us doing, which is focusing on getting the PPE to those who needed it as fast as we could in that crisis.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Speaker, the Committee for Standards in Public Life is currently taking an inquiry focused on the upholding of the Nolan principles of public life, and those principles include integrity, accountability and openness. So given that it has been reported that civil servants delayed publications at the behest of number 10 special advisers, and given that we've ended up in a situation where this matter has been taken to court, I would like to ask the Minister whether he agrees the Government has met those standards.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her question. What I would do in answer is revert back to what the judge said, Mr. Justice Chamberlain, or Lord Justice Chamberlain, in his findings in this case, that he found no evidence of a policy of deprioritisation of meeting transparency requirements and publication.
Now we go to Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My Dudley North constituents, like me, can see right through this urgent question for its petty political intent. But for the avoidance of doubt, will my honourable friend confirm how many people came to harm because this paperwork was 2 weeks late, and compare this to the harm that would have arisen by receiving PPE and medical equipment 2 weeks late?
Very grateful to my honourable friend, Madam Deputy Speaker. Transparency is important. The Chair of the Public Accounts Committee and others have quite rightly made that point. But saving lives is important, and I would argue in the height of the pandemic, more important. And it was right that civil servants and others focused entirely on that purpose, in getting the PPE to avoid, to reduce the risk of loss of life, and have worked very hard subsequently to catch up, as the judge acknowledged, with the transparency requirements to make sure the information is published and is available for interrogation.
Matt Western.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As they say, if it smells of fish, it's fish. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this case, it's like Billingsgate Market. For when it comes to government contracts, you're 10 times more likely to get one if you have a government contact. The protocols are clear, as the Supreme Court confirmed, and the Health Secretary acted unlawfully in not revealing the details of contracts with his pub landlord, a hedge fund in Mauritius, or the jeweller in Florida. Yet there was insufficient PPE available in our social care system. As the NAO said, 10% of what was required. And for our frontline health workers, just not enough FFP3. The Minister says that trust is vital, but isn't it the truth that ministers' mates and their suppliers in China have been favoured over UK companies such as Techman and Contex in my constituency in supplying PPE?
That was a very long speech. I don't want the honourable gentleman to create a precedent. Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman and his initial analogy, if I may. A couple of points he makes there. I believe, and this is from memory, so forgive me if I'm slightly out and I'll correct the record if I am, that around 90% of those bids that came through the high priority lane were rejected. So they were assessed, but they were carefully assessed by civil servants against the 8 stages of the procurement process set up to ensure due diligence was followed. But he raised a very specific point, and I do want to address this because he talked in his question not just about NHS trusts, but he talked about, quite rightly, about those working on the front line in social care settings and the PPE they needed. He quotes accurately, if my recollection is correct, from the NAO report. One of the factors here was that, of course, traditionally social care settings procured, our private businesses in most cases procured their PPE directly in private contracts with their suppliers. That's one of the reasons why during this pandemic, during this early phase, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we moved from supplying 226 trusts to making that service to get PPE to social care to 58,000 settings or so. And that was a reflection of the government's commitment and work to make sure that we could use this centralised procurement and this centralised supply to help support the social care sector get what it needed.
Jacob Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I commend the government for their efforts to do whatever it took to protect the front line during the height of this pandemic. Will the Minister join me in extending our thanks to the amazing NHS workforce and the armed forces working at James Cook Hospital and Redcar Hospital, as well as our teams in primary care, without which we would not have vaccinated 18 million people?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very happy to join with my honourable friend in doing that, and I suspect that in what's been a contentious urgent question, that is a point where I think we would have consensus from both myself and the Shadow Minister in paying tribute to those working in the front line of our NHS, social care and those helping with the vaccination programme.
Jim Shannon.
Does the Minister share my view that while transparency is important, saving lives is even more important? And that the public servants who have done much to secure the vital supplies of protective equipment we so vitally need deserve our praise, not criticism. Will the Minister clarify that the information that is required by the judicial review judgment will be revealed in a timely manner? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right to pay tribute to those officials and those who were working flat out at the height of this pandemic, often through the night, often through weekends, and even when working from home they didn't see much of their families, I suspect, at this time, because they were working incredibly hard to procure the PPE we needed to keep people safe, and I pay tribute to them. And to his final point, yes, my understanding is that the additional information required by the judgment is required to be supplied to the court by Friday, and I would expect the judge to make that public.
And finally, we go to Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Speed is vital during a public health emergency, but transparency does remain important. What assurances can my honourable friend give that while paperwork can never come before delivering essential medical equipment and services to the front line, this government is committed to publishing contracts in a timely manner to make sure that my constituents in Dudley South can have confidence that processes are fair, open and transparent?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. Getting PPE to the front line, procuring what we needed and getting it delivered was the absolute priority. But I do recognise, as I've expressed in my remarks throughout, that transparency is hugely important as well. As I've alluded to, we will supply the court with the further information it needs. We are now, as the judge said, virtually in complete compliance, and we will continue to work hard to ensure that we comply with the requirements under Regulation 50 and the other requirements of the PCR going forward.
Thank you. I will now briefly suspend for 3 minutes in order that arrangements can be made for the next item of business. Order!